All right, it is that time of week again. I'm Josh Durso. I'm joined in studio by Ted Baker, and this is the Debrief Podcast. It's Friday, September 10th, and we've got back to school, coronavirus, the ongoing pandemic, a school bus driver shortage, controversy at the Ontario County Sheriff's Office, and so much more. Of course, we're going to be answering your questions along the way as well. Ted, welcome back. It's been a couple weeks, but here we are.
We're still in a pandemic, right?
We are still in a pandemic.
Good. So we have things to talk about.
Yep. It seems like we forever will be in a pandemic too, as it turns out. Yesterday we had, let's start with this. Yesterday we had the pretty big announcement and rollout from President Joe Biden. Plan and pledge to get 100 million people vaccinated by mandate. Employers, it seemed like there were a few big things that stuck out, but the biggest thing that stuck out, or the thing that seemed to get people most riled up, especially on social media, was the mandate that would effectively get 100 million people vaccinated or covered under mandatory vaccination. Any employer with 100 or more workers would be required under this plan to get vaccinated. Not really any huge workaround there. He would be using, the president said that the Department of Labor would be involved, and then also OSHA would be involved. Sounds like we're starting to see the federal government move in a more forceful direction with this thing after asking quite nicely and politely for the last 7 or 8 months. What were your takeaways on what we saw happen yesterday?
Well, I'm always torn because you should get the vaccine, but I'm not sure that government should be in the business of compelling people to do things like this. I mean, we have a really interesting dichotomy this week between the left and the right. On the left, they feel that compulsory childbirth for pregnant people in Texas is an outrage, but forced vaccination is okay. On the right, they think the opposite. So it doesn't seem like either side's really for freedom. They're there for their freedom, but not the other guy's freedom. We have to do something. And one thing, we talked about this morning, I thought one mistake the president made. In his statement, he said that we have to protect the vaccinated from the unvaccinated. In truth, we have to protect the unvaccinated from each other. That's the problem. Those of us who got the shot months ago and try to comply with mask mandates and stuff are just sick of this. We're sick of people running around yelling freedom while spreading a deadly disease that we should have been done with back in March or April, and we thought we were.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about it in the context of schools a little later, because it was one of the questions that you brought up. But it starts to really get to the center of this, what good will it do debate. You can mandate it, you can force it. We're going to talk about staffing shortages in hospitals and everywhere else, and you've got all of these things going on in the world right now, and it doesn't really seem like pulling another mandate down is going to be the fix to it. Now, the flip side of that is, I've been saying now on the show and elsewhere for that matter, this has been coming. If you've been watching what's been happening in the world, in the United States, this has been coming. This shouldn't surprise anybody, and I think it will effectively be a full mandate sooner than later. And, it is just a matter of getting people warmed up to the idea of getting vaccinated like they get vaccinated against a billion other things, and they don't care and they don't mind.
And very often in these cases, when it comes down to, I think when people are faced with get the shot or lose your job, a lot of people are going to put down their freedom banner and just go get the shot. And I think between that and I still believe that there has to be a natural burning out of this virus at some point. I mean, at some point, everyone is going to either have had it or get vaccinated. There was one story this week that said, according to one study, if you have the virus and then get vaccinated, you're going to develop superhuman immunity for all time. So it just seems to me like one way or another, this has to go down.
Yeah.
Would you agree? I can't see the curve continuing to go up and up and up, because we're going to run out of people to infect.
Yeah, and I think we've been seeing, different studies on that across the board. Even as different variants are introduced, there's sort of a natural tapering off of how how strong those variants are, and there's plenty of science out there that says eventually we will get to that point. I think the bigger issue is, and I think a lot of people are focusing on this from what's happening in the United States standpoint as opposed to what's happening in the rest of the world view. And if I'm looking at everything, looking at the big picture, the global picture, I'm more concerned about how effectively people are being vaccinated across the rest of the planet than I am about how many people in Missouri or in Kansas or in Florida or Arkansas, Louisiana are opposed to getting vaccinated. Because what will happen there is that's a very short-term thing, right? Like, they will get sick, they will develop immunity, unfortunately, we may lose some more people as a result, but that's sort of like a short-term thing. The prospect of large chunks of the rest of the planet not being vaccinated at all, or maybe going another year or two before they are vaccinated, is much worse when you start to think about like the prospect of more variants and what those variants could potentially do and what they could eventually, I suppose, do against the vaccine itself. So that to me is kind of the bigger issue. And unfortunately, American politics is very focused right now on what's happening inside the United States and in pockets of the United States, where frankly, this is as much an issue of, I don't want to call it like cultural divide, but that's effectively what it is, right? Like, you have people who live one way of life in one type of community or in one portion of the population, and you have a group on the other side who lives differently. And those two groups have opposing views of what's right and wrong as far as vaccination is concerned, or what is right for them. And
there's becoming a growing pushback in the rest of the world against booster shots in America. Like you said, people are saying, okay, we have all these countries where no one's got a shot at all yet, and in the wealthy West, now you're talking about your boosters, your second and third shots, and it's a global world. I mean, that's a very good point. We can stomp out COVID in the United States, and if there's an outbreak somewhere else, it's going to find its way to our shores eventually.
Well, and we only have to look back to the beginning of the pandemic, right? Like, that's exactly how this whole thing started. We got here because of travel between Asia, Europe, and North America. Not really any more complicated than that. And that is exactly when you start to talk about travel to the Middle East, travel to Africa, and travel to other parts of the world where there isn't as much of the vaccine being distributed. Yes, this was something that a month ago, when the World Health Organization was saying, the United States should hold off on booster shots, even though it doesn't appear that that's the case at all. I think September 20th was the last date I heard rattling around. The United States should have held off, and should have, frankly, instead of putting all of this energy into worrying about and politicizing who doesn't want to get the vaccine here, get the rest of the world vaccinated, or help get the rest of the world vaccinated who wants to be vaccinated, so that you can have a better global vaccination rate against this virus.
Right. I mean, it doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care if it's in Africa or Europe or Asia or the United States, and it is a worldwide problem. And that's interesting, because that aspect of it rarely gets reported on or commented on outside of the U.S.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about schools here. First football game cancellations we've seen. Obviously, Geneva. Varsity football, maybe another level of football as well, has been put on the mini pause. We've also seen most recently in the last 36 hours or so that South Seneca is going on pause. The health department put them on pause because of some positive tests. Not a huge surprise, I suppose, but what are your thoughts as you look toward the rest of the fall sports season? We're like a week and a half in, 2 weeks maybe in, since first practices and tryouts and stuff. What's that tell us about the rest of the fall season, and what that potentially may mean, I guess, for sectionals and championships and states and all that kind of stuff?
Well, I know the State Association just came out with a statement saying that the championships are on. I guess I back up to the decision to send kids back to school in the first place, and there was a lot of pressure. Parents wanted it, families wanted normal school. We're all in agreement, hybrid online learning, despite the best efforts of teachers and parents and families to pull it off, isn't as good. But having said that, was it wise to take the least vaccinated population in the United States, which is kids, and send them back into small rooms in close contact with each other? I mean, you can really make a case that just wasn't a good idea. But then again, we go back to the early part of the summer and we thought it was over. It really looked like it was. I mean, you remember my prediction about Labor Day? I said, by Labor Day we'll be done. Well, 3 months before Labor Day we were done, and then we started coming undone. So I really question the decision to just say go back to school, and I think it was driven not by science, not by health experts, but by pressure from the public who said we don't want another year of Zoom classes.
Yeah, and to that end, I kind of think, school probably could have happened without much of an issue, in-person learning. Even if you have classes that need to quarantine or whatever the case may be, isolate, you can do that without too much issue. But I'm not sure you can navigate a real athletic season and call it any semblance of normal if you have teams that are still, just like last year, having to drop games, not play for a week stretch or a week and a half stretch or whatever it may be. And we've seen, I guess the frustrating thing for a lot of folks here is they heard coming into the season that the vaccine was effectively going to need to be required, right, for student athletes if they were going to participate. I think a lot of people assumed that that's what actually happened. And frankly, I'm not even sure if that is or isn't the case because there hasn't been any concrete reporting on it since. But it becomes a head scratcher when you're quarantining students who had exposure who are also vaccinated, if that's the case. Because what we've been hearing from the jump of the vaccine, regardless of whether, vaccinated people should be wearing masks in public or not, is that if you're vaccinated, you don't need to quarantine if you just had exposure or contact with a person who had COVID-19. So it's partly a messaging problem, but also kind of like a what were our expectations problem. This probably should have been seen coming in the beginning of August or maybe even before that. Delta was moving really fast. Students obviously clearly were not going to be student body as a population from K through 12 was not going to be fully or majority vaccinated by the time school started or by the time tryouts for these different sports happened. So, I mean, what were we expecting to happen here?
I continue to find it interesting. A lot of the discussion is about deaths and hospitals being overwhelmed and patients on ventilators. And yet it seems like the most common COVID experience is I felt a little crummy. I got a test. It was positive. Now I got to sit in the basement for a week. I mean, not to minimize the destruction it has caused in some people. There's no doubt. But, like you say, if somebody's vaccinated and they test positive, what's the appropriate response scientifically? That's been my complaint all the way back to March of 2020. Is that we haven't been following the science like so many people urge us to. We've been following politics and pressure and all kinds of other things except for what's scientifically indicated. What should we do? If you're vaccinated and you test positive, do we have to quarantine you?
Yeah.
It sounds like a lot of people would say that the answer to that is no, that you really don't. So to go back to what you were asking about long term, I think this is the tip of the iceberg. I think we're going to see, I really don't see any way that sports are not going to begin to unravel. I've already predicted that, I'm doing Hobart football broadcasts. We have about 4 more road games to go. I think before the end of the season, I'm going to be denied permission to go to one of those games. Unless these mandates, the carrots and sticks work and people start getting vaccinated, I don't see us going in the right direction. It's been now, a couple of months since we kind of bottomed out and thought we were done.
Yeah, it's definitely a head scratcher. It does look like we're going to see vaccine mandates in schools. We're starting to see some school districts across the country move in that direction. Los Angeles, obviously the largest, most high-profile one, I think this week or either late last week, announced that all students, once the vaccine is fully allowed and legal and all that kind of stuff and approved, will be required, period, full stop, no second options. Is that, to me, it feels very clear like that's where we're headed. I don't see any scenario where that isn't what's happening in real life by, say, January or February.
Yeah.
Is that does that match what you're feeling, or do you think like this could like actually last longer, where it doesn't become a full-fledged mandate until maybe next year or sometime further down the road, or maybe never at all?
I think it'll be sooner than later, and like I say, I'm always conflicted. I'm not a big fan of compelling people to do anything. I don't think government ought to be in the business of compelling people's, because it always ends up being one side of the divide trying to compel its beliefs on the other, is what it's coming down to. Now, scientifically, get the shot. It's safe. It works. If you don't have it by now, unless you've got some medical reason, you're just dumb. So just go get it. And that's what we're seeing is the people pressure. Those of us who got the shot and want to get on with our lives are running out of patience for whether you're a Donald Trump supporter or just a plain anti-vaxxer from way back when. We're running out of patience, and we don't want to have to jump through these hoops because you won't get a free shot at Walmart.
Does it feel like there is a bit of tiptoeing happening with the state and its messaging towards vaccinations in schools, particularly among staff and teachers, given how strong the teachers' union is in New York State? That has been, to me, one of the more compelling storylines throughout this entire thing, is that you have these two clearly left-leaning entities, the Democrats, clearly left-leaning, and then you've got the teachers' union, NYSET, clearly left-leaning, has been a big driver in Democratic politics in New York State for 3 decades. And yet they can't get on the same page with vaccinations at all. And it's ironic because it even seems like the rest of the progressive part of the United States is moving in that direction. And yet the teachers union seems compelled to stick to its guns as far as the state nor anyone else should be mandating vaccines at all.
Yeah, well, and there's always been that strong streak of freedom in the United States, and that's like I said, I believe in that to a certain degree. So it's hard for me to just say, that it should be mandated. So, and the other thing about mandates is that if you begin forcing people, many times it just simply hardens their resolve.
Right.
I think there's a core of people out there, the more you turn the screws for vaccination, the more they dig in their heels and say, no way.
I think there's a catch to that, but we're going to talk about that in a little while. Let's talk a little bit about, since we're in back to school mode, there's a bus driver shortage. Obviously, Rochester City School District has gotten a lot of attention over the last week or two, mainly because it almost derailed their in-person learning altogether. They're using RTS as kind of a holdover, but a lot of districts have been faced with this. And as it turns out, a lot of good local reporting across the entire country has shown that this is not only a problem in Rochester or Finger Lakes or upstate New York, but rather across the entire country. It's everywhere. We've got a shortage of bus drivers. Now, there are a lot of reasons that I've read for it. Essentially bad timing with retirements. You get essentially a very similarly aged majority of population bus drivers, and that has essentially caused a wave of retirement that wasn't really getting backfilled properly because they were all employed. But now we look forward, and I'm curious, are there any mechanisms in place that could potentially fix this problem? Or is this something that school districts are just going to have to figure out a different way to get students to school?
Well, there's a free market. If you can't get bus drivers at $20, try 25. If you can't get them at 25, try 30. You'll eventually reach a point where there'll be lots of willing bus drivers. I mean, it really is that simple. It's fascinating to me to watch so many people who've touted the free market for so long now suddenly not like it when it's not to their advantage. And you know, like you said, there's been a lot of reporting on these problems. There's been, to my mind, limited reporting on figuring out why. And for those who watch this every week, you've heard my theory many times, but I'm going to float it again. I think that people changed their way of living during the pandemic, and I think a lot of people started questioning whether they really needed that second or third job to chase a few more dollars. Maybe we live a little more frugally, and maybe we don't need it. I mean, bus driver is not a full-time job. That's usually a second job for somebody, very often older people, retirees. And I think, so what we're seeing is a fundamental change in the balance of power between the employer and the employee. For a long time, the employer could pretty much dictate, and the employee had to accept the terms they were given. Now the shoe is on the other foot, and nobody can find people to work.
Yeah.
And so there's your free market solution. If you can't find people to work at wage X, then go up until you do. If you're selling a product and nobody buys it, you drop the price to the point where they will.
Yeah, and I think you brought up a good point there. I've had a lot of conversations with people about this, and there seems to be this pretty broad assumption that these jobs are full-time jobs across the board universally. Like, there aren't part-time bus drivers, but in a lot of districts, bus drivers are part-time. They work a little in the morning.
Well, I would think in most. I can't imagine there are many places where it is full-time, right? You do a couple-hour run in the morning, couple-hour run in the afternoon.
So to that end, to me, that's problem number one, right? Nobody wants a part-time job, no matter how good it pays, because you can't live off of a part-time job in the United States, not presently. And yeah, like you said, you got to pay better. Those are the two things that need to happen if the problem's going to be solved. But I would actually argue that those are the exact two reasons why it won't ever be solved, or at least won't be solved in the next several years, because what you're seeing now is schools just figuring it out. And I think they're working through the process of, shortening routes or changing routes or adding this or adding that, putting more bodies in a bus or whatever the case may be, just to make the math work on getting kids to school. And there will come a point after a year or two of this, and after a year or two of not filling any of those positions, where the districts just throw their hands up and say, well, I guess this is it. This is how we do it now. And that'll be it. But again, this mirrors so many of the quote-unquote business struggles, economic struggles that we see when we hear people talk about nobody wants to work, nobody wants to get out there and go do things, this, that, and the other thing. It's because of those two factors. Part-time employment doesn't work in this economy, and you got to pay better. $20 an hour to drive a bus where you're responsible for, 30-ish kids, $20 an hour or $22 an hour, that math doesn't work when you can go make $18 an hour at McDonald's. It just doesn't. Yeah, it's less money, but it's also a lot less responsibility. You can go in and flip burgers for 8 hours, go home, and you don't have to decompress for 2 hours like a lot of the bus drivers that I know or have known over the years. They talk about that 2-hour decompression that they need after their day because the job is really stressful. Like, that is just a reality. And I think, when it comes to this, maybe another, just spitballing, but maybe another solution would be some of these districts getting together and saying, can we have what is essentially like tandem transport, where multiple districts are working together and they have a shared service agreement on transportation. Or maybe, just maybe, this is how we fix the public transportation problem in all of these communities too. Why do we have buses going out for 2-hour patches during the day and have them doing nothing in the middle, when no no community in the Finger Lakes or in, frankly, upstate New York that isn't a city like Ithaca or Rochester, Elmira, Syracuse, Buffalo has reliable public transportation.
But the problem is there's never been successful public transportation in other than pretty big cities without giant subsidies. I remember I was a bus rider for a while when I lived in Massachusetts. I was not far from the University of Massachusetts, so there were buses I could get that would take me into work. My wife had the car at the time, and there were many days that I would get on a bus and be the only passenger on a full-size 40-something seater bus, and there's just no way that can be self-supporting. It's the idea is great. I don't know. There's got to be a solution somewhere, but there just aren't. I guess we're such a car society. Without a complete change in mindset, nobody really wants to ride a bus. That's what you do when you have to. What we want to do is get in our car, fire it up, and drive a straight line to where we're going and be there 15 minutes later.
Is it not subsidizing a busing operation if we have to inflate wages 25 to 50% to get people to take the jobs?
Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, you're subsidizing. So what I'm saying is, I guess, if we're going to have to invest more money and say pay these people $30 or $35 an hour to get them to do it, why not get them to do it all day long instead of just doing it for 4 hours a day and serve the community on top of what is the student population as well? Right.
That's what I mean. That it sounds like a great idea, but how many people are going to catch the bus in Ovid on a given day? You know, that's the problem of, I mean, this goes back to one of our grand themes about the dying of rural America. There are just so many factors, and that's another one. There's not enough population density to have good employment opportunities, to have public transit. Those things are not easily doable in sparsely populated rural America.
I know some people aren't going to like hearing this or like hearing me say this, but so what if we just said they had routes, and even if they didn't transport anybody, if we were paying them, say, $20 or $25 an hour, and we didn't have to raise their wages, but they were guaranteed a full-time job, wouldn't it be better that we have full-strength busing for students, plus any busing needs in communities filled, and get those people the full-time wage they need to actually fill the positions? Isn't that like a fair, like when you take those three things, like isn't that a fair enough trade, right? Like even if the buses aren't moving or the buses don't need to move, if you're at least employing the people full time so that they're willing to go do this job that is really stressful, sitting around doing nothing is almost better than making kids, pack in like sardines on a bus because, North Rose has to drop four routes or whatever the case may be.
No, none of this stuff is easy. I mean, it's congratulations if you can solve it.
I think the big thing is like there are certain ideals that people have about work and about how people make money that are just going to have to be dropped. Like this idea that you need to be busy at all times at work, that you need to be working hard at all times at work to make a living wage or something. Like if we just break that part of our American brain, everything else becomes a lot easier to solve because all of this anger, all of this frustration and vitriol is essentially housed in the lowest income communities of this world. And it's fueled by Republicans and it's fueled by Democrats. But at the end of the day, you have poor people fighting with poor people over peanuts.
Yeah. And I think our American culture has been really centered around work. I mean, when you get right down to it and you're planning your week and you're planning what you're going to do with your wife or your kids or whatever, what's the first consideration that you have to discuss? Oh, work. Well, I have this meeting and I have this so I think that's what's happened during the pandemic. I think some people have broken free of that cycle and discovered that they like it. I use the example a lot of the second member of a couple taking a job and all the proceeds of that job go to pay for the second car and the child care. So the wife or the husband says, why don't I just stay home?
Right.
And we make a little less, but we don't have a second car, and we don't have child care, and you don't have to buy work clothes, and you don't have to go out and eat, and you find that you can make it work. So I think we're seeing a shift in mindset away from work being the primary thing in our lives. You know, we all talk about family and everything, and I think some people have found a way to make that happen.
Yeah.
And the world of employment is going to have to adjust, and so far it's not doing that. It's kicking and screaming. It kicked and screamed about the minimum wage increase. Every time there's a minimum wage increase, employers tell us it's the end of American business, and then it's not, and we move on.
Yeah, and I guess that's kind of the puzzling thing to me is, you know, there's been a lot of pushback from even local restaurant owners. I've seen it almost every day on social media. This person who owns a restaurant or that person who owns a restaurant is, you know, closing this day and that day because they can't find cooks or they can't find waiters or waitresses or whatever the case may be. And it just becomes if your business model isn't sustainable, if you have to pay people a quote unquote fair wage or a modern wage, forget about it being fair, take fair out of it. Like if it's a modern wage and your business can't sustain it, then your business model doesn't work.
Pay them more and raise the price. I mean, seriously, I don't think people are going to stop eating out if their entree goes from $20 to $22. I really don't think they will.
So let's talk a little bit about the eviction moratorium. We have received a mountain of negative feedback about the eviction moratorium, its extension into January, even though there were some additional protections granted to landlords in the most recent version that was signed into law by Governor Hochul. Let's talk about this, though. Prevention. How could this have been prevented? Because that's the question that I keep coming back to over and over and over again. And all of the mechanisms from the beginning were there, right? Like, we had the mechanisms in place. We had these big spending packages in direct aid and stimulus going out. We had, in the American Rescue Plan, we had all of this rent relief money that was earmarked, in New York's case, I think over $2 billion earmarked for landlords and tenants to access to make them whole. And yet I keep coming back to this thought. All of this anger, all of this vitriol, all of this frustration from not only landlords but tenants on the opposite side of the coin could have been avoided if landlords were just made whole to begin with.
Well, I guess that's my first question. I just I had Assemblyman Mankalo on today. I had Senator Helming the other day, and they both talked about this money. So what is this money, and why hasn't the state made it available? The complaint is that first the Cuomo administration and now the Hochul administration are sitting on this giant pile of money that came from the federal government that could be paid out to these people, and it isn't being paid out. So that's my first question. I don't understand why. Why isn't this money? Because that, like you said, that's kicking the can down the road and pushing the moratorium out, 6 more months, 12 more months, doesn't fix the problem. The problem is they need some money. So get them the money and then get it paid. But that, though, creates another set of problems. So renters are given money to pay their rent. Well, Ted Baker, mortgage holder, is not given money to pay my mortgage. That's one of the problems we deal with, is that anytime you give money to one person or group, another group will pop up and say, why not me?
Well, and I think, so one thing that you just mentioned that made me think about what Governor Hochul rolled out to begin with was a more simplified process for getting those funds. The complaint against it before, when the state comptroller released a pretty lengthy report on the topic, was that only about 110 million of the $2 billion-ish had been dispersed, and that was because of the red tape and the complications associated with applying. And I've heard anecdotal evidence of what that process looks like. Like, you need the tenant and the landlord to be actively engaged in the same process and all this other stuff. And there's just this natural divide between the two. So, and also clearly this animosity between these two groups of people, right? I just think, like, again, this could have been so much simpler. Like, the state knows who's renting properties. It's not a secret. They pay taxes. Landlords pay taxes. Make them whole. Take it off of the tenant's plate completely if you want to extend the moratorium. And then you don't need a moratorium because they've been made whole. And on top of that, this moratorium, while it's being celebrated on the left, is in no way, shape, or form a solution for that group of people who is now, in some cases, potentially like up to 18 months behind on rent. It changes nothing. It changes nothing in that equation, because as soon as this thing ends in January, all of that rent is going to come due, and they will be moved through the eviction process probably more quickly than they would have in the quote-unquote old eviction process, because these, all of a sudden, you're going to have people owing, 2.5 years, essentially, of
Well,
rent?
and here's what I'm wondering. I've had a couple of different people in my program that I've asked about this lately, and nobody seems to really know what the scope of the problem is. So, I mean, are there a lot of people who just haven't paid their rent for 18 months? Or is it more people who didn't pay in March, April, and May of 2020, got back to work, are now paying, but are behind? That's what, nobody seems to have any real, I asked a couple of different people, what percentage of landlords have tenants who are in arrears? And nobody really seems to know. So it's hard to solve the problem without really knowing what it is. And I don't know what you're hearing anecdotally. I mean, do you think there are a lot of people who simply haven't been paying for 18 months? Or is it, like I said, somebody got furloughed, didn't pay for 3 months, they're paying now, but they've never been able to catch up on those 3 months?
I don't want to speak out of step, but one of the stats that I had heard, and I believe it was from the Finger Lakes Landlord Association, was that something like 70% of the people who were not paying or who were in arrears were doing so essentially just by choice, and it wasn't really a financial hardship situation.
Which, again, and that's the other question I was going to bring up, is that's, how do we put a system in place that differentiates between people who had a legitimate COVID-related problem and people who went, yippee, I don't have to pay my rent?
Do we have the ability at this point to pick and choose? That's my genuine curiosity with this thing.
Probably not, honestly. Probably not.
We're past the point of being able to pick and choose about who did and who didn't have the right circumstances to pay or not pay. Or
yeah, I think you're right.
Whatever the case may be. I think priority A just needs to be getting the landlords whole, and then when the moratorium ends, essentially starting over.
So here's another question, though. When we talk about making whole, do we make them 100% whole, or do we say, okay, you're going to have to settle for 80% or 70%? That's the best we can do.
I mean, we're in the process of spending, $3.5 trillion in this most recent proposal from the Biden administration. I think we can afford to make everybody whole. Might as well, right? I mean, we churned out stimulus money over the course of 3 rounds, and I think there's still some hope that there's going to be a 4th round of stimulus here sooner than later. And that cost billions upon billions. These packages cost north of $1 trillion, or I should say the last one cost north of $1 trillion. We've got this one, $3.5 trillion. I think you're hard-pressed to make the argument that there's not enough money to make the landlords 100% whole. And
it's interesting to hear you make that argument, because that's a very liberal-sounding argument, and it's one that I've made against conservative opponents of government spending in the past, which is government spends money on a lot of things. So it really isn't that you're against government spending. You just don't want it spent here. You want it spent over here. So your point being that the United States government has the money to do this if it wants to. And I think you're right.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't, essentially this is it's not a math problem. It's a who deserves it problem. Right, and that's really what that's the politics becomes that. It becomes,
and that's generally,
who deserves this more.
Sure, that's always the argument over government spending. We don't want it to go to those people.
Yeah, and I just think at this point, with decades of continued growth in spending and everything else, I think it's really difficult to make that argument that anyone should be left out at this point. And especially, frankly, government at all levels has dropped the ball in kind of a miraculous way throughout this pandemic. If you look at how the federal government responded at the very early stages, if you look at how, if you want to take New York State and say, well, New York State dropped the ball on rolling out unemployment benefits. Remember that whole fiasco? You had people waiting months and months just to get one week's worth of unemployment check. You've had issue upon issue with rolling out this rent relief to tenants and to landlords. This process that's totally gray and bureaucratic and just a mess. And, make it right, make it simple, start over once this thing is actually over. And if you want to, I think one of the issues probably right now is that Republicans are getting ready for the housing fight that takes place after the pandemic, because this is going to be used as a springboard. This continued moratorium is going to be springboarded into a policy of housing should be guaranteed 100% of the time, and it should essentially not be a for-profit business, period. Housing is a right, I suppose, is what a lot of people say. So that's what they're guarding against, I think. When you're hearing Senator Helming and Assemblyman Manctolo and those types of people, bash the eviction moratorium, what they're really doing is they're setting up for what the fight is they know that's coming down the road. And that's
right. I mean, largely during this debate, the right has been arguing on behalf of the landlords, and the left has been arguing on behalf of the tenants. And, we're all people, and it's all one and the same. But again, and like I said, you talk about who gets the money. Okay, so renters get it, but what about mortgage holders who didn't pay their mortgage for 3 months?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm making kind of pain in the butt arguments here. I mean, I agree overall with your theme, which is that this is doable. It's not like we don't have the money to make these people whole. Yep. We do. We just have to say, all right, let's do it.
Yep. Let's talk a little bit about this employee exodus that appears to be coming if you talk to different folks in healthcare. Obviously, the mandate is that they get vaccinated. All healthcare workers get vaccinated against COVID before the end of the month, essentially. I think it's the 27th, if I'm not mistaken. That has prompted a lot of onlookers and politicians and even people who run healthcare facilities to say the state should really consider this mandate because we're going to lose a chunk of our employees. And it's interesting. I think it was it was a hospital in Syracuse, and I can't think of it off the top of my head. I'll link to it in the show notes, where one of their administrators effectively said, we're planning on losing 30% of our unvaccinated workforce at the end of this month. So 30% of the 25% who are unvaccinated. So say roughly, 10% of the total workforce, maybe, or 8 or 9%. Is this a real concern? Do you see this as a real fundamental issue for healthcare for the industry as a whole, if there is going to be a mandate that's fully followed through?
It'll be interesting to see. Number one, if 30% of the people providing our healthcare don't even have the vaccine, then please do leave. Leave today, because we really don't want you in healthcare. I mean, seriously. On the other hand, is it going to be 30%? I doubt it. It goes back to what we talked about earlier. When the rubber meets the road, as much as we don't want to be governed by our jobs, we still are for the most part. I think most people will just put down their freedom flag and get the shot. However, having said that, there's never been a better time to transition out of a career into something else. So I suppose with all these jobs open out there, if I'm in the healthcare field, and you think of healthcare and you go, doctors with Cadillacs playing rounds of golf, but the healthcare field also includes, janitors and orderlies and people that don't make a whole lot of money. So if I'm an orderly at the hospital and they're telling me to get vaccinated and I don't want to, then, maybe I'll go become a bus driver at $20 an hour or go to McDonald's. So I think there'll be some exodus. I can't imagine it's going to be 30%. Because, again, a lot of people like to protest and shout freedom and wave their flag. But when it comes down to it, you're going to go home to your wife and say, "That's it, honey, I'm leaving my job." And she's going to go, "What are you, an idiot? Get the stupid shot."
Yeah, and I'm not really sure how. I just don't see there being legs behind that philosophy that I'm just gonna quit. I don't see it. And
I
frankly,
think there'll be some.
Where are you gonna go? Because now we're seeing that employers that have more than 100 workers,
right?
Schools, everywhere else, like this vaccine is going to be mandated. So you're going to have to go, I guess, start your own unvaccinated business.
Yeah, eventually there's not going to be any place left to hide. We're going in that direction, like it or not. Carrot and stick. We'll pay you to get it, or we'll fire you if you don't.
All right, so a little local politics here. Obviously, Ontario County Sheriff's Office has been in the headlines for all of the wrong reasons over the last 5 days. Started with kind of a surprise announcement / press release from Sheriff Henderson, who essentially defended himself from accusations that hadn't even been publicly made yet at that point. That prompted Ontario County, the Board of Supervisors, and the county administrator to step up to the plate and actually say what's been going on now for about a year and a half behind the scenes. A lot of HR issues, a lot of complaints, a lot of systemic issues in the jail, what sounds like accusations of sexual harassment, sexual assault, and illicit relationships between corrections officers and female inmates, and a lot of stuff, and a lot of stuff that hasn't had due process to find out if it's true or if it's not. So I don't want to get into too much of the accusations. I want to focus more on this, what I think has been a pretty good cover-up job by the Board of Supervisors, right? Like, the Ontario County Board of Supervisors hired outside legal counsel in January to handle what they saw coming. And here we are in August, and now we hear about this situation where effectively the board is asking the sheriff, an elected official in Ontario County, to resign, and the undersheriff retiring, whatever you want to call it. That to me is pretty miraculous. I think that is maybe one of the most stunning turns of events. And my hope is that as this thing plays out, people really start to scrutinize the Board of Supervisors more for what they fell short on, which was being open with the public. You can talk about what was done wrong over this administration and what sounds like leaked or came from the previous administration in the sheriff's office all you want, but there was also a very clear effort made here to not allow this information, or the fact that the board was even that interested in investigating the sheriff, stay very close to chest over the last 7 to 8 months, because the Monroe County District Attorney was involved. This has been something that's been playing out for some time. What are your thoughts on that half of this thing?
I think if Jackie Augustine were here with us, she'd be pounding her head on the table again in frustration. Government transparency. Even setting aside the fact that this investigation has been going on for months, just the announcement with vague sort of charges. To me, if you're going to accuse a man and his department of something, you should say what. We're starting to get the picture emerge a little bit, but and clearly, the sheriff felt it necessary to issue a preemptive release. So that was my first thought. Was, at first it was, what did he do? Vague HR this, and now, like you said, some of the outline of the story is beginning to emerge. But this is not the government we need to have. You represent us. You are our public servants. If there's a problem with our sheriff's department, you need to tell us what it is. And here's the second part of this. I still don't know to this day, what does moving the 911 center out from under the sheriff's department have to do with any of this? Nobody's explained that yet at all. That was the second piece of the supervisors meeting, and we still don't know, to the best of my knowledge, any idea why that was done. So this was a giant failing on the part of the supervisors and county government. And, if you're the sheriff, and full disclosure, I know Sheriff Henderson. He comes on my show once a month. I like him. He was supposed to be on yesterday and emailed me that he would not be appearing, not surprisingly. How do you defend yourself against charges when it's not even really clear what the charges are? So I think that if you're going to investigate the sheriff's department, you should announce that fact publicly. I suppose the counter-argument is that it's harder to conduct an investigation if everyone knows it's happening and they'll close ranks and all those sort of things. But when in doubt, err on the side of openness. This whole, we're going into executive session, personnel matters. Well, everything's personnel matters. We need to know a lot more about what our government is doing on our behalf. So, and I'll say what I said yesterday when the sheriff wasn't able to come on. I hope that the full truth of what happened will come out, and I hope that the end result will be fair and just to everyone involved.
Yeah, and I think, my frustration, you watched last night's meeting, and they go into executive session for 2 hours plus. They come out, they approve 2 resolutions, and if you're just watching, it's not really clear what the resolutions are that they're approving or accepting. We had a reporter there, Todd Elsey. We'll have a story up later today on the whole thing. And actually, the reason why we couldn't go to press with anything last night was because there needed to be so much follow-up because of how just dysfunctional that meeting was.
If the 911 center is going out from under the sheriff, where's it going?
Right.
Who runs it now? I mean, that's a big thing to do that we have to believe is somehow related to this investigation. But again, unless I've missed something, I have not seen any piece of information explaining what that has to do with anything.
The county's residents are largely in the dark with all aspects of this, and I don't see that improving anytime soon, unfortunately. Ted, where can folks listen to you Monday through Friday?
I'm on the Finger Lakes Morning News. In Auburn, that's 96.3 and 1590 WAUB. In Geneva, it's 106.3 and 1240 WGVA, and at various football and soccer stadiums all over upstate New York.
And you and I will be chatting on Thursdays now instead of
Fridays. Right. Our schedules are crazy.
We are.
Anyone who'd like to be the next Steve Penstone, call me. We're still looking to fill that position. And until then, we're moving things around. So 6:50 a.m. on Thursday, Josh will be joining me each week.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for listening. You can hear Ted Monday through Friday on Finger Lakes News Radio. Be sure to join us back here next week. We'll see you then.